Welcome back to the Advanced Photo Manipulation Movie Poster Effects course. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are now on lesson number 9. And in this lesson, we are going to take a look at how to add some scratch and rust effects to our Iron Giant. Okay, so here's where we last left our robot. After adding the shoulder guns and giving him a sword, it's time to start making him look a little bit more realistic, because even though we used photographs for the metal and mechanical pieces, it's looking very clean and just very sterile. And it's not how you would expect a battle-weary robot to appear. So the whole idea of this lesson is we are going to take some of these other images of some metallic damage, some rust and some scratches and some denting, and show how to add these textures onto our robot, which will enhance the level of realism. Now, before I go any further, I'm actually going to combine a lot of these construction layers together. I don't actually recommend doing this. If you're doing your own project, it's really good to keep these together and instead of combining them, just create a merged layer of them. But because I'm providing so many files for this course and each lesson has its own source file, it's a bit redundant to have these construction layers available in these later lessons like this. So I'm going to grab all of these layers of the robot with the exception of the shoulder gun, the shoulder armor, and the sword, and I'm just going to merge them all together. Layer, merge layers, and call that one base. Okay, now the general workflow for adding these is very similar to the workflow we use to add the mechanical parts, but it's a little more varied even. What I like to do is grab a section that I know I will be using because it contains a lot of good texture information in it. And just copy that. So now I have this as a type of base texture to work with, because I'm going to actually hide that one and create copies to use. So I'll copy this one down, reveal the copy, and transform it. So for instance, if I want to add some of this scratched detail on his chest plate, I can move it up into there. I'm going to change the blending mode, and this is really where you're going to get the effects of this. I often use like an overlay or a soft light, especially when it's a multicolor texture. Now, if it's primarily a dark or a light one, for the dark ones, you would use multiply. For the light ones, you would use screen. But in this case, since it has both, I'm going to stick with overlay. And then you just manipulate this into place till you get an arrangement of it that you really like. And don't forget, you can also warp it so it further matches the curves of the original metal. I usually trim it down with the eraser tool. So the areas that I don't want overlapping, I just knock them out with the eraser. And I always clip it to the base, and just in case a corner of it tends to stick out over outside of the contour of the robot, this way it just keeps it all within the same lines there. Now, as simple as that seems, that is really the primary technique that's used to add these grunge elements to the robot. Now, there's a couple of different files that I recommend using. This file number 195 is really good for this. It's got some great damage in there. 771 we've seen before. That's got a nice metal sheeting effect. 782 has some spectacular rust effects in there. Now, you may not want to keep the screws because it really does portray a very small piece, because these screws kind of betray the size of that. So you may want to just grab those with the selection tool and use the content aware to knock those out before you create your base element over here. And then file number 826, I ended up using as sort of random mechanical gears and pulleys and levers and bolts and smaller detailed mechanical looking items to layer in here on some of the areas that was looking a little bit large, because the key to making the entire figure look really big is to fill it with a lot of details that are really small. So I'm not going to go through and show every single one that I add, because I do end up adding, I think, somewhere near 24 different layers on top of this, just to fill in a lot of the grunge areas. And I fully encourage you to use this technique, get familiar with doing this yourself, because using this technique on your own artwork is one of the things that will really elevate the realism of it. Okay, so here we have my robot all grunged up. If you really want to take a look at which files I placed where to create the grunge effects on mine, you can look at the source file that I've included with the course files. Now there's a couple other techniques that I want to go over quickly here before we leave this lesson. And mostly that's involving how to create your own brushes for your own rust and grunge brushes. For example, if we zoom in on this piece of metal here, there's some really beautiful scratches going on. So if we want to create our own brush of that, we would highlight the area that's scratched, just select that, copy that, and then go to a new file. That's Control or Command N for new. It automatically hits the preset to the clipboard and paste that in. Now you need to fully desaturate that. So you pull out all the color information. That's Image, Adjustments, Desaturate. And then we need to use a Levels command to increase the contrast significantly. Okay, now the way that custom brushes work in Photoshop is that it looks at the dark areas as positive. So we need to invert the way this looks. So Image, Adjustments, Invert. And so now the dark black areas will be the actual scratches of the brush. And we want to avoid having hard edges on that. So I'm going to use the eraser tool to knock off these edges all the way around it. Now, the gray areas in between will show up as a little bit dark. So I want to lighten those. To do that, I'm going to use the Dodge tool. It's set to midtones, and use that just to lighten up those midtone areas to help isolate the dark scratched pixels. Okay, so when you get it to a point that you like the way it's looking and you're satisfied with the amount of dark to light, you go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and let's name this one Scratch. If you were using a brush before you defined it, it automatically switches to that brush. If not, you'll find it in your brush list all the way at the bottom. Let's go over and try this out on our robot. I'm going to create a new layer here. Clip that one in, of course, and call this one Scratches. I'm going to select a light gray color, not the solid white that we had. Make sure my opacity is up high so I can see it. Now, if you just click once, you're going to get a very large scratch area. So let's reduce the size there. You don't want to drag these because it creates a very noticeably repeating pattern. You want to use these judiciously and just single clicks. And you want to vary the angle of it. Now, if you're using Photoshop CC, like I am, you can right click and get this brush angle widget very easily in the context menu. Now, in some areas, you may want to switch it up and use a darker color to just add more visual interest and enhance the effect just that much more. Okay, now you can do a similar technique with the rust brush too. Remove some of these screws in here, like we mentioned before, using Content Aware. And then I'm just going to select this whole area here with this rusty corner in it. And copy that to its own file. Pull out the saturation of that by desaturating it, using the Levels command to increase the contrast dramatically, and then softening those edges. Another hit of the Levels command to get the dark areas nice and dark, and then set that as a brush preset. Rusty. Now we can go back and add a rust layer. Now in this one, I'm going to use a color burn blending mode, and then pick a rust colored paint color. So that now when I create my spots, or really they're stamps, creating a rust effect. Custom brushes are a really, really powerful tool for creating high quality, high interest pieces of artwork that looks very realistic. Okay, so now we've got a really dirty, grungy, battle-scarred robot here. This is looking really pretty good. Okay, so that finishes off the scratch and rust effects. So what we have now is this big, dirty, greasy, battle-scarred robot. And it's looking almost kind of steampunky at this point because it's looking very old and very battle-weary. And we want that, but we also want it to look kind of high-techy. We want it to look modern, like it's a machine that wasn't built back when locomotives ruled the earth. So to do that, we need to add some glow effects to it. It needs to have some light that would indicate some modern aspects of it. And that's going to be the next lesson, Lesson 10. Be sure to join me for glow effects.